useless now, Margaret." My daughter-in-law said it so casually that several people around the dinner table actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because they were uncomfortable. Because nobody wanted to be the person who challenged Olivia Carter when she decided to make someone the target of her sharp tongue. My son Ethan lowered his eyes to his plate. My two grandchildren kept eating their mashed potatoes. And I sat there quietly with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the steam rising from my coffee. Olivia smiled as if she'd just made an innocent joke. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued. "You don't drive anymore. You don't work anymore. You barely use a smartphone. You spend most of your time gardening. What exactly do you do these days?" A few nervous chuckles circled the room. I looked down at my napkin and smoothed a wrinkle with my fingertips. Then I smiled. Not because her words didn't hurt. They did. But because at 72 years old, I had learned something important. When people desperately want to underestimate you, sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let them. "You're probably right," I said softly. Olivia looked pleased with herself. Ethan looked relieved that I hadn't turned the evening into an argument. The conversation moved on. They started discussing a home renovation project. A larger kitchen, new hardwood floors, expensive appliances, plans for the future. Nobody asked for my opinion. Nobody expected me to have one. I simply sat there and listened. The irony was almost amusing. The dining room they sat in owned to me. The property taxes had been paid by me for nearly 3 decades. The family trust that quietly protects everything around them exists because of decisions I had made years earlier. Yet Olivia looked at me as if I were an old woman taking up space in a house that had somehow become hers. She wasn't the first person to mistake silence for weakness, but she was about to become the person who regretted it the most. That dinner took place on a cool October evening in Cedar Ridge, Ohio. The maple trees outside my kitchen windows had started turning shades of gold and crimson. Fallen leaves gathered along the edges of the driveway. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. Daniel would have loved that evening. My late husband always said autumn made the whole town feel like a postcard. Daniel had been gone for 3 years. Some days the grief still arrived unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a familiar smell, an empty chair. But over time, grief had changed shape. It no longer feels like a storm. It felt like a shadow that quietly followed me from room to room. After dinner, Olivia stood and began clearing plates. "Mom," Ethan said carefully, "maybe you should think about downsizing eventually." I changed at him. "Downsizing? Just something to consider," Olivia answered before he could continue. "This house is a lot for one person. You know, maintenance, repairs, responsibilities." There it was. Not the first hint. Not even the 10th. But perhaps the clearest. Olivia had been planting these seeds for years. Little comments. Small suggestions. Casual observations disguised as concerns. Always leading toward the same destination. A future where I quietly stepped aside. A future where decides to belong to someone else. I nodded thoughtfully. "I'll keep that in mind." Olivia smiled again. She thought she was winning. She thought I didn't notice what was happening. She thought age had made me slow. Invisible. Harmless. What she didn't know was that 6 months earlier, I had opened a locked cedar box Daniel left behind. Inside was a letter addressed to me. And that letter changed everything. As I watched Olivia stack dishes and discussed her plans for my future, I remembered Daniel's final words written in careful handwriting across a single sheet of paper. I remember the warning. I remember the instructions. Most of all, I remember the sentence that suddenly made perfect sense. "Don't tell them what you know, Maggie. The truth reveals people faster than any test ever possible." So I sat quietly at the table and let Olivia believe exactly what she wanted. I let her believe I was useless. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, just as I had for most of my adult life. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that seemed to settle into the walls after years of routine. I stood in the kitchen wearing my old gray sweater and waited for the coffee to finish brewing. Outside the window, a thin layer of frost covered the lawn. The maple tree Daniel planted 20 years ago stood motionless against the pale morning sky. I wrapped both hands around my mug and looked across the backyard. There was a time when this house felt full. Saturday mornings used to begin with pancakes, laughter, and muddy shoes tracking across the floor. Ethan would race through the kitchen carrying toy trucks while Daniel pretended to complain about the noise. Back then, every room seemed connected by warmth. Somewhere along the way, that warmth faded. It did not disappear all at once. It left in small pieces. Looking back, I realized that Olivia never pushed me out directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she operated through little changes that seemed harmless at first. Family dinners moved from every Sunday to once a month. Holiday gatherings became smaller. Phone calls became shorter. Invitations arrived later and later until eventually they stopped arriving altogether. Each change looked insignificant on its own. Together, they told a different story. I remember Tommy's 8th birthday party 3 years earlier. I spent weeks knitting him a blue blanket covered with baseball patterns because he had just joined Little League. When I arrived at the restaurant, Olivia greeted me with a surprised expression. "Oh, Margaret, did Ethan forget to tell you? We changed the reservation time." I had smiled and handed Tommy his gift anyway. Ethan later apologized and said there must have been a misunderstanding. At the time, I believed him. Then there was Emma's school recital. Olivia assured me it started at 6 o'clock. I arrived early and sat in the front row. The auditorium was nearly empty. A janitor eventually informed me that the performance had ended more than an hour earlier. I drove home alone that night feeling foolish, yet somehow I convinced myself it was another mistake. There were dozens of moments like that, small enough to ignore, painful enough to remember. Over time, I became a guest in the family I helped build. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I walked through the house carrying a basket of laundry. As I passed the hallway, my eyes landed on a framed photograph hanging beside the staircase. It showed Ethan at 16 years old standing next to Daniel. Both of them were smiling after finishing a fishing trip. Ethan had been such a thoughtful boy. He used to leave handwritten notes on the refrigerator before school. He never forgot birthdays. He never missed an opportunity to help a neighbor shovel snow. Sometimes I wondered where that version of my son had gone. Then I realized something even more troubling. He had not disappeared. He had simply become comfortable letting someone else make decisions for him. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message from Olivia. She wanted everyone together the following weekend to discuss long-term family planning. I stared at those words for several seconds. Long-term family planning. It sounded official, careful, innocent, yet something about it unsettled me. I remembered the conversation from the night before, the comments about maintenance, the suggestions about downsizing, the way Olivia watched me when she thought I was not paying attention. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and slowly walked toward the living room. There, tucked inside the bottom drawer of Daniel's old desk, sat the cedar box I had not opened in months. The same cedar box that contained his letter. The same cedar box that held answers nobody else knew existed. For a moment, I rested my hand on the polished wood. Then I smiled softly to myself. Olivia believed she was planning my future. What she did not understand was that Daniel had already planned for this day years ago. I did not open the cedar box immediately. Instead, I carried it into the sunroom and placed it on the small oak table Daniel had built with his own hands nearly 20 years earlier. The room smelled faintly of old books and lemon furniture polish. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long rectangles across the hardwood floor. I sat down slowly and looked at the box for several minutes before touching the brass latch. The first time I opened it after Daniel passed away, I could barely see through my tears. This time was different. This time I was looking for answers. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a handful of handwritten notes, and the letter that had changed everything 6 months earlier. I unfolded the letter carefully. Daniel's handwriting was unmistakable, strong, deliberate, familiar. Reading it still felt like hearing his voice. "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to explain things myself. I know you. You will try to believe the best about everyone. That is one of the reasons I love you. But there are things you need to understand." As I continued reading, the memory of that first discovery came rushing back. 6 months earlier, I had found the box while sorting through old records in the basement. At the time, I thought it contained little more than family documents. Instead, it revealed a side of Daniel I had never fully seen. For years, he had quietly managed investments, legal protections, and financial arrangements designed to safeguard our future. Not because he distrusted Ethan, not because he expected conflict, but because he believed that money had a way of changing people, especially people who thought they deserved it. One document in particular stood out, a family trust agreement. I remembered staring at it for nearly an hour the first time I saw it. The trust controlled the house, several investment accounts, and a parcel of commercial property outside Columbus that generated steady income every year. Everything had been structured with extraordinary care. Most surprising of all, Daniel had named me as the sole decision-maker. Not Ethan. Not any future heir. Me. My fingers rested on the pages as I remembered the shock I felt that day. For decades, I had allowed Daniel to handle most of the legal and financial details. I trusted him completely. Apparently, he had trusted me just as much. There was another note attached to the trust documents. This one was shorter. If anyone pressures you, slow down. If anyone rushes you, say no. If anyone underestimates you, let them. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like Daniel. Patient. Practical. Always thinking 3 steps ahead. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in months. Benjamin Ross, Daniel's attorney and longtime friend. I answered immediately. "Margaret," he said warmly. "I was meaning to call you." "Good timing," I replied. I was just looking through some of Daniel's papers. There was a brief silence. "The cedar box?" he asked. "Yes." Another pause followed. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. "Then perhaps it is time we had lunch." We agreed to meet the following Tuesday at a small restaurant near the courthouse. After hanging up, I sat quietly for several moments. Benjamin was not the type of man who made mysterious phone calls. If he wanted to meet, there was a reason. Outside, a breeze rattled the autumn leaves against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a lawn mower humming. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. Yet something felt different. The pieces were beginning to move. That evening, another message arrived from Olivia reminding everyone about the upcoming family meeting. Her wording was cheerful, friendly, almost overly cheerful. I read it twice before setting my phone aside. Then I looked across the room toward Daniel's photograph resting on the bookshelf. He was smiling in the picture, wearing his favorite flannel shirt, standing beside the fishing boat he loved so much. "I think I understand now," I said softly. For the first time in years, I no longer felt confused about what was happening around me. Olivia was making plans. Ethan was following along. And somewhere ahead, a conversation was coming that would change everything. The family meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Olivia chose the time, the location, and even the menu. That alone told me more than she realized. People who feel secure do not usually need to control every detail. Throughout the week, she sent cheerful group messages filled with smiley faces and enthusiastic reminders. Anyone reading them would have assumed she was organizing something thoughtful and inclusive. I knew better. By Thursday, the temperature had dropped into the low 50s. The trees lining my street had surrendered even more leaves, covering the sidewalks in shades of amber and rust. I spent most of that morning working in the garden, trimming back the rose bushes before winter arrived. Gardening had become one of the many things Olivia considered evidence of my irrelevance. She often spoke about it as though it were little more than a hobby for someone with too much free time. What she never understood was that gardens reward patience. They teach you that not everything grows according to the schedule you want. Some things require seasons. Some truths do too. Around noon, I drove into town for my lunch meeting with Benjamin Ross. The restaurant sat across from the courthouse and had been there for decades. Daniel loved their chicken pot pie. Benjamin was already seated when I arrived. He stood to greet me and pulled out a chair. His silver hair had become thinner over the years, but his sharp blue eyes remained unchanged. After we ordered, neither of us rushed into the real reason for the meeting. We spoke about the weather, the town, the grandchildren, ordinary subjects. Eventually, Benjamin folded his hands on the table. "Margaret," he said carefully, "has anyone approached you about changing ownership structures, transferring property, or modifying estate documents?" The question did not surprise me. "Not directly," I replied, "but I suspect they are building towards something." Benjamin nodded slowly. Daniel thought that might happen one day. Hearing those words sent a quiet chill through me. He really planned for all this, did he not? Benjamin smiled faintly. "More than you know." He reached into his briefcase and removed a folder. "There are additional instructions connected to the trust. Most of them only become relevant if someone attempts to pressure you into major financial decisions." I stared at the folder. Additional instructions? Daniel believed protection worked best when it remained invisible. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waitress arrived with our meals, and we waited until she left. Then Benjamin leaned forward slightly. "The most important thing right now is simple. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. And most importantly, Do not reveal what you know. I thought about Olivia's constant confidence, the certainty in her voice, the way she spoke about future plans as though they were already approved. I do not think she sees me as a threat, I admitted. Good, Benjamin said. Keep it that way. When lunch ended, I walked back to my car feeling strangely calm. Not relieved, not triumphant. Calm. For months I had been trying to understand why so many conversations felt rehearsed, why certain suggestions kept appearing, why I increasingly felt like a guest in my own life. Now the picture was becoming clearer. By Saturday morning, Olivia's excitement seemed impossible to hide. She texted everyone twice before noon. Ethan called to confirm I was coming. His voice sounded nervous. Not hostile. Nervous. That detail stayed with me long after we ended the call. As the afternoon approached, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting a simple navy blue cardigan. The same one I had worn countless times. Nothing flashy. Nothing dramatic. Downstairs, the cedar box remained locked inside Daniel's desk. I glanced toward it before leaving. Somewhere inside those documents were answers that could change the direction of every conversation waiting for me that afternoon. Olivia believed she was preparing a discussion about my future. She had no idea she was walking into a situation Daniel had anticipated years before. And for the first time, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting to discover what Olivia wanted. I already knew. The real question was how far she was willing to go to get it. When I arrived at Ethan and Olivia's house that Saturday afternoon, several cars were already parked in the driveway. The sight surprised me. Olivia had described the gathering as a small family discussion. Apparently, her definition of small differed from mine. I stepped onto the front porch carrying a pumpkin pie I had baked that morning. Old habits are difficult to break. Even when people stop appreciating your efforts, you still find yourself making them. Olivia opened the door before I could ring the bell. Her smile appeared polished and welcoming, but something about it felt rehearsed. "Margaret, you made it," she said brightly. "Of course," I replied. "You sounded very eager for everyone to be here." Her smile tightened for a fraction of a second before returning. Inside, I found Ethan standing near the fireplace speaking with his cousin Mark and Mark's wife Denise. Emma sat cross-legged on the living room rug coloring in a book. Tommy was playing a game on a tablet. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed tension moving through the room like an invisible current. Ethan hugged me when he saw me. The gesture felt genuine. That made everything more complicated. "How are you doing, Mom?" he asked. "I'm doing just fine." He nodded, but avoided holding eye contact for long. I noticed that immediately. People often reveal their discomfort without realizing it. During the next hour, Olivia kept everyone busy with snacks, drinks, and casual conversation. She laughed often. She complimented people constantly. She played the role of gracious hostess with impressive skill. But every few minutes, I caught her glancing toward the dining room table where several folders had been neatly arranged. She was waiting for the real meeting to begin. Finally, shortly after 4 o'clock, Olivia stood and clapped her hands softly. "All right, everyone," she said. "Let us sit down. There are a few important things we should discuss as a family." The room gradually quieted. Chairs scraped against hardwood floors. Conversations faded. People settled into their seats. I chose a chair near the end of the table and folded my hands comfortably in my lap. Olivia remained standing. "First," she began, "I want to say that this comes from a place of love." Whenever someone starts a sentence that way, experience has taught me to pay very close attention. We have all been concerned about Margaret living alone in such a large house. Several heads nodded cautiously. Ethan remained silent. Olivia continued. "The property requires maintenance. There are repairs, expenses, responsibilities. We all want what is best for her." There it was again. Concern carefully wrapped around control. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes about practical matters. Safety, convenience, future planning. Every word sounded reasonable when examined individually. Together they formed something else entirely. Then she placed a folder in front of me. "We have done some research," she said. "There is a wonderful senior community about 20 miles away. Beautiful facilities, activities, transportation services, everything you could possibly need." I looked down at the folder but did not open it. The room became very quiet. I could feel people watching me, waiting for my reaction. Olivia mistook my silence for uncertainty. In reality, I was observing, studying faces, measuring loyalties. Denise looked uncomfortable. Mark seemed confused. Ethan stared at the table. Only Olivia appeared confident. Completely confident. It was remarkable, really. She had spent years convincing herself she understood exactly who I was. An aging widow. Out of touch. Easily guided. Someone who needed decisions made for her. She never considered another possibility. She never imagined that I understood far more than she realized. As Olivia launched into another explanation about downsizing and simplifying life, I simply nodded occasionally and listened. The more she spoke, the clearer everything became. And somewhere deep inside, I could almost hear Daniel's voice again. Be patient. Let them show you who they are. That afternoon, they were doing exactly that. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The silence that settled over the dining room felt heavier than all of Olivia's carefully prepared arguments. She seemed to interpret my calm expression as hesitation. That was exactly the mistake Daniel had predicted people would make. Olivia pulled another document from her folder and slid it across the table. We even put together some options, she said cheerfully. There are floor plans, pricing information, and activity schedules. We thought it might help make the decision easier. Easier. I almost smiled. The decision she spoke of had never actually been presented as a choice. It had been framed as an inevitable next step, something already decided that merely required my cooperation. I glanced down at the papers without touching them. Color photographs showed smiling retirees walking through landscaped courtyards and attending group events. Everything looked pleasant enough. That was not the point. Across the table, Ethan finally cleared his throat. Mom, nobody is trying to pressure you. The moment he said it, several people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even Ethan seemed to realize how defensive the statement sounded. I looked at him gently. I did not say anyone was pressuring me. His face reddened slightly. Olivia quickly stepped in. We are just thinking about what makes sense long term. Again, that phrase. What makes sense? It was remarkable how often people used those words when discussing someone else's life. Denise quietly folded her hands together. Has Margaret said she wants to move? She asked. The question landed like a pebble dropped into still water. Small, simple, yet impossible to ignore. Olivia's smile flickered. Well, no, not exactly. Then why are we discussing floor plans? Denise asked. Mark glanced at his wife with mild surprise. Olivia laughed lightly, but it sounded forced. We are only being proactive. I remained silent. The more Olivia talked, the more people seemed to notice things they had previously overlooked. Sometimes all it takes is time. Time and enough rope. Emma looked up from her coloring book. Grandma Margaret likes her house. The room became quiet again. Children have a way of cutting through complicated conversations with startling honesty. Olivia smiled tightly. Of course she does, sweetheart. Emma returned to coloring. Meanwhile, I watched Ethan. His discomfort was growing. For years, I had blamed Olivia for nearly everything. Sitting there, I began to see the situation more clearly. Olivia may have been steering the ship, but Ethan had willingly climbed aboard. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because I was angry, because I remembered the young man he used to be. The boy who once spent an entire summer mowing lawns to save enough money for my birthday gift. The teenager who insisted on carrying groceries for elderly neighbors. Somewhere along the way, convenience had replaced courage. Eventually, Olivia gathered her papers into a neat stack. Nobody expects an answer today, she said. That statement was technically true. What she expected was something more subtle. She expected momentum. Agreement. The beginning of a process that would gradually become difficult to stop. I nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate everyone's concern. Relief flashed across her face. She thought the meeting had gone well. She thought progress had been made. The irony was almost painful, because while everyone prepared to leave, I found myself thinking about the folder Benjamin had shown me at lunch. The additional protections, the hidden provisions, the safeguards Daniel had built so carefully. Olivia believed she was guiding events toward a destination she had chosen. She had no idea that the road beneath her feet belonged to someone else entirely. And as I watched her confidently collecting empty glasses and thanking everyone for coming, I realized something important. The time for simply observing was almost over. The week after the meeting passed quietly on the surface. Beneath that calm, however, something had shifted. Olivia became more confident. Not less. More. She interpreted my politeness as agreement. She interpreted my patience as surrender. Every few days, She found a reason to bring up the future. A brochure left on the kitchen counter during a visit. A casual comment about retirement communities. A passing remark about how difficult large homes could become for older people. I listened to every word and offered almost nothing in return. By the middle of November, the first snowfall arrived. A thin white layer covered the rooftops and lawns across Cedar Ridge. I stood at my living room window watching snowflakes drift past the maple tree Daniel had planted years ago. My phone rang shortly after breakfast. It was Ethan. His voice sounded unusually formal. "Mom, Olivia and I were hoping to stop by Sunday afternoon." I already knew this was not a social visit. "Of course," I replied. "You are always welcome." When Sunday arrived, they came alone. No children. No pie. No casual conversation. The moment I saw the leather portfolio tucked under Olivia's arm, I understood exactly why they were there. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. Olivia wasted very little time. "Margaret, we have been thinking more about our last discussion." I nodded. "I assumed you had." She smiled. "We found an opportunity that might solve several problems at once." There it was again. Problems. My life had somehow become a problem that required management. Ethan shifted in his chair, but said nothing. Olivia opened the portfolio and removed several documents. "If you transferred the house into a family management arrangement, it would make future planning much easier." She slid the papers toward me. I did not touch them. Instead, I looked at Ethan. "Have you reviewed these?" He hesitated. "Yes." That single word hurt more than I expected. Not because of the documents. Because he had already chosen a side without speaking to me first. Olivia leaned forward. "This protects everyone." Protects everyone. Another familiar phrase. Benjamin had warned me about language like that. People often use protection when they really mean control. I glanced at the first page. Most of the legal terminology was exactly what I expected. Temporary authority. Property oversight. Future estate efficiency. Everything sounded reasonable until you looked closely enough to see what was actually happening. Olivia watched me carefully. She expected confusion, uncertainty, dependence. Instead, I calmly turned another page. Then another. The room grew quieter with every second. Finally, I set the documents down. "I will need time to review these." Olivia blinked. "Of course, but there is really nothing complicated here." I smiled politely. Then there should be no problem giving me time. For the first time since she arrived, her confidence wavered. Only slightly. But I noticed it. Ethan noticed it too. The conversation ended soon afterward. They left carrying the expectation that I would eventually cooperate. As their car disappeared down the street, I walked back inside and closed the front door. Then I picked up my phone and called Benjamin Ross. He answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you would call," he said. I looked across the room toward Daniel's photograph resting on the bookshelf. "They brought the papers today." Benjamin was silent for a moment. "And?" I smiled. "I think they are finally ready to learn what Daniel spent years preparing for." 3 days later, Benjamin arranged a meeting at his office. The invitation was simple. Ethan and Olivia assumed it was a routine discussion about the paperwork they had presented. In reality, it was the first time every piece of Daniel's planning would finally come into the light. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and gray. A layer of snow covered the courthouse lawn across the street from Benjamin's building. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat quietly in the reception area. Benjamin greeted me with a reassuring nod. He did not need to say much. We both knew what was about to happen. Ethan and Olivia arrived together a few minutes later. Olivia looked confident, more confident than I had ever seen her. She carried another folder tucked neatly beneath her arm. When she smiled at me, it was the smile of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. We gathered around the conference table. Benjamin opened a file and adjusted his glasses. "Before we discuss any proposed changes," he said calmly, "there are several trust provisions that everyone should understand." Olivia's expression remained pleasant. "Of course." Benjamin slid a packet across the table. These documents were established by Daniel Hayes several years before his passing. Ethan leaned forward immediately. Olivia did the same. For the first few minutes, Benjamin simply reviewed background information, ownership structures, investment accounts, property holdings. Then he reached the section I had been waiting for. "Under the terms of the trust," he continued, All major decisions regarding the family assets remain under Margaret's exclusive authority. Olivia blinked. Exclusive authority? Benjamin nodded. Correct. The room became very still. Ethan looked confused. I thought everything transferred to the family after Dad passed away. Benjamin shook his head. No, that is not how the trust was written. Olivia glanced toward Ethan. For the first time, uncertainty appeared behind her eyes. Benjamin continued. The residence, investment portfolio, and commercial property remain protected assets. No transfer, sale, restructuring, or management change can occur without Margaret's approval. Silence followed. Real silence. The kind that settles over a room when expectations collide with reality. Ethan stared at the documents. Olivia slowly turned another page. The confidence that had carried her for months was beginning to disappear. Benjamin was not finished. There is another provision. He opened a second folder. Daniel specifically anticipated the possibility of future pressure being placed upon Margaret regarding housing, asset control, or financial management. Olivia's face lost color. Ethan looked up sharply. Dad wrote that. Yes, Benjamin replied. In considerable detail. I said nothing. I simply watched. Months earlier, I might have felt anger. Sitting there now, I felt something else. Clarity. Benjamin handed copies of Daniel's letter across the table. Ethan began reading immediately. Olivia followed. The room remained silent except for the sound of turning pages. As Ethan continued reading, his shoulders gradually sank. Daniel's words were unmistakable. Loving, honest, direct. He had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. He had simply explained why he wanted to protect me from future pressure and ensure that no one could gradually push me aside. When Ethan finally looked up, his eyes were fixed on the table. Olivia closed the letter without speaking. The woman who always seemed to have an answer suddenly had none. Benjamin folded his hands. The trust was designed exactly as Daniel intended. Nothing has changed. Another long silence followed. Then, for the first time since the meeting began, I spoke. Daniel spent years building security for this family. My voice remained calm. Not because he expected conflict. Because he believed responsibility should never be confused with entitlement. No one interrupted. No one argued. Outside the office window, snow continued drifting down over the town. Inside, the balance of power that Olivia believed she understood had completely shifted. And for the first time, everyone at that table finally saw the truth Daniel had protected all along. The meeting ended quietly. There were no dramatic speeches. No raised voices. No grand confrontation. Life rarely unfolds that way. Most of the important moments happen in silence. Ethan remained seated for several seconds after Benjamin closed the final folder. He stared at the documents as though he were seeing his father for the first time in years. Olivia gathered her papers slowly. The confidence that had accompanied her into the office was gone. In its place was something else. Uncertainty. The realization that assumptions can feel like facts until reality arrives. We walked out into the cold afternoon together. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. Cars moved slowly along the street. The town carried on exactly as it had the day before. That struck me as strangely comforting. Even after life changes, the world keeps moving forward. Ethan stopped beside my car. Mom. His voice sounded smaller than usual. I turned toward him. For a moment, he struggled to find words. I did not know, he finally said, about any of it. I believed him. That was the hardest part. Ethan had not been malicious. He had simply stopped paying attention. There is a difference. Both can cause pain, but only one leaves room for redemption. I know, I said softly. He looked down at the snowy pavement. I should have asked more questions. Yes, I replied. You should have. Neither of us said anything else for a few seconds. Then I reached out and squeezed his arm gently. The gesture surprised him. Perhaps he expected anger. Perhaps he thought I had spent months preparing a list of grievances. The truth was simpler. Carrying resentment is exhausting. I was too old to spend my remaining years doing that. Olivia stood several feet away waiting beside their vehicle. She avoided looking directly at me. I could see dozens of emotions moving behind her expression. Embarrassment, frustration, regret, maybe even shame. But I did not need an apology to move forward. Some lessons teach themselves. I drove home through falling snow and parked in my driveway just before sunset. The house stood exactly where it always had. Strong, familiar, steady. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Warm air greeted me. The scent of cedar and old books lingered in the hallway.